Good morning.
Good morning.
That's righteous. Appreciate the introduction and the invitation. It's good to be in the greater Boston area when there's sun. And yes, I'm taking it back with me. I brought it. Sorry, but we'll be back in November. It was actually kind of amazing because yesterday I went, after doing some work at Waltham, I went for a run, and I got a call from a homie that's back in Oakland, and he's like, "Dog, it's raining here." And then I FaceTimed him, and I'm like, "Well, it's 80 degrees here." So I don't know, my head is all messed up right now. So the talk that I was asked to come and do today feels like a really good fit for the work that you all are trying to do out here in your respective spaces. Because it's actually a reaction to about the last 7 years of work that I've been doing with districts around the country and a pattern that I've been seeing. So, as you all know, just by virtue of being in this space, equity's all the rage. Yeah, it's like right. And so I've been asked to be a thought partner with a number of schools and districts around the country around their equity work, and to be a reader of their equity strategic plan. And so let me just start by saying that if you have an equity office or an equity officer, that's how you know you don't have equity. Because equity doesn't live in an office, and it doesn't live in a strategic plan, and it's not one person's responsibility. Okay? Everybody's an equity officer, or nobody's an equity officer. Okay? So as I've been brought into these various conversations, the frequency with which I see these two words used interchangeably is stunning to me and also scary to me. Because what it means is that a number of places are embarking on this pivot from inequality, okay, under the guise of equality, okay, to pursue equity, okay, without really defining what equity even means. Okay? And so we start there by disentangling these two terms. Okay? An equal education system versus an equitable education system. And I just want to be clear as we start this conversation today that the move from an equal education system, which by the way we've radically failed at as a nation, right? Everybody clear about that? Okay? Worst kept secret in the United States, okay, is that when we're just talking public schools, we're not talking Babson College, like super private, okay? In public schools, right, everyone in the country knows that the schools that serve the nation's most wounded and vulnerable communities have the least resources. And the schools that serve the wealthiest communities have the most resources inside of our public, equal public system. Okay? Everyone knows this. So, this idea of moving from that system to an equitable system is not a soft pivot. It's a hard pivot. And if you're not ready to do that hard pivot, which means really understanding, okay, and your moral compass, right, how are we turning? Right? How far are we turning? How quickly are we turning? Then the ship won't turn. Right? And so this talk is really about framing that up, okay, and connecting you to some of the leading research that we have over the past 4 decades, okay, that makes it clear that this is the right move, okay, the pivot from an equal education system to an equitable education system. Absolutely, everything we know in the research and the best that we have in practice in meeting the needs of the nation's most wounded and vulnerable youth, this is the move. And so I want you to leave this talk today armored up, okay, to not even have to have this debate. It's not a debate in the research community. Right? So don't engage in a debate. There is no point engaging in a debate with people that are immoral. The best you can hope for is to end in a stalemate. So put your armor on, right? And you need not spend any time debating about whether or not equity is the right move, because we know absolutely, with total clarity in the research, across fields, social epidemiology, public health, neuroscience, child development, psychology, and the medical field, all agree, absolutely no debate, equity's the superior model. In fact, economists even agree. Okay? It's hard to get economists to agree on some social justice shit. Okay? Even economists agree, right? Equity, right, is fundamentally important for the survival of any pluralistic multiracial democracy. So this is the journey, right, that I want to begin us on today. So let's do a quick history lesson. Why did we even have a conversation about an equal education system in this country? Where did that come from? Okay, Brown v. Board, okay, which happened in what year? Okay, 54, right? Brown v. Board, Supreme Court of the United States. Now, why did the Supreme Court of the United States, the highest policy organization in the land, have to legislate that we needed an equal education system? Why did we have to have that? Because why? Because we didn't have it. Well, yeah, okay. Why didn't we have it? I mean, we're a pluralistic, multiracial democracy, right? Question mark? Why didn't we have equal education system? Because it was a white supremacist system? Okay. I wouldn't use the past tense there. Okay. Why not? Why? No, keep going, sister, keep going. Keep going. Keep going. Why? Okay. Word. And because it was actually the law. The Supreme Court of the United States legislated inequality. It was the law. Let's just make sure that we're starting there, right, when we talk about the work we're doing in public education. Because it's baked into the foundation of the buildings where you show up and do the work every day. It was the law. Unless you got a jackhammer and rooted it out, it's in the concrete where you stand every day to do the work. Plessy versus Ferguson, the Supreme Court of the United States legislated inequality. What was the line in the Plessy decision? Separate. Okay. Separate is equal. Okay. Was the law of the land. That's why you got Brown. Brown was legislation to respond to legislation. People think Brown popped out of nowhere, right? Because some folks were upset with de facto segregation. No, segregation was the legislated law of the land. So Brown, right, is a decision about a decision. Right? So Brown says what? Plessy says separate is equal. Brown says separate is by definition unequal. And this begins a journey that we are now 7+ decades into of the pursuit of an equal education system. Now, part of the Brown decision, a big part of the Brown decision was about desegregating public spaces and public institutions. Right? And a primary focus of Brown, obviously, was schools. So, we are now 7 decades. Sorry, I'm a social scientist. Is that right? 6 decades? Whatever, okay? Right. We're a ways into this journey, okay? And anybody know how much progress we've made? Since the Supreme Court said, okay, it is illegal to have schools be racially segregated. Even though how much progress, let's do some prices right. Okay? 10%, 15%, 20%, give me some bids. How much progress do you think we've made in desegregating city schools in the United States? Said 0. You can't bid 0 on the Price is Right, can you? I think you got to bid at least 1. Why not? Right. Okay, so we got the seat, we got the floor set, right? Anybody think we're doing better than $1? 15? Anybody want to go higher than 15? 40? How many are familiar with the work of Gary Orfield at UCLA, formerly of Harvard? Okay, good. All right. Gary's research team, he now runs the UCLA Civil Rights Project. Okay, you can look this up on there. They publish their reports all the time. So Gary's a lawyer by training, right, but one of the better educational historians in the country. Right, Gary's team every 10 years releases a report, okay, on the progress we've made on Brown. So the 60th anniversary report just came out not too long ago. And Gary's team concluded that not only have we made no progress, we've actually gone backwards. Yep. Hey, I don't know how they do negative on the Price is Right. Okay. But according to the best research we have in the country, okay, city schools are now more racially segregated than they were before the Supreme Court of the United States said that's illegal. And that, y'all, is the value of a policy. You will not policy your way out of this. Your strategic plan around equity will not save you. It will not create equity. You will people your way out of this. Now, I'm not saying that policy doesn't matter. Of course policy matters. Okay? Ask anybody who taught under No Child Left Behind. Okay? Policy matters. But policy won't save you. The work that you've got to do, if you're going to make this hard pivot from an equal education system to an equitable education system, is about people. Okay? Everybody's an equity officer or nobody's an equity officer. Okay? All hands on deck to move this battleship, okay, onto a hard pivot, right, away from the promise that we failed to deliver on now for 6+ decades to a brand new promise of equity. Now, as I've come to do this work and to understand the difference between equality and equity, okay, Keith, I think you jinxed my clicker. He said, "Do you have a clicker?" I was like, "Yeah, bro, it's not my first rodeo." Now my clicker's not working. I know why, too, because we just got done doing presentations in my grad class. And, of course, you know, your grad students never bring their clicker. So I gave them my clicker, and it is now coded for the desktop in my grad seminar class. So this shit ain't going to work. So we're going to do it by hand. No, we're good. Don't freak out. We're good. Like, everybody's like, "Oh, good, help him with his clicker." Right? It's literally right here, right? I'm all good, for real. So as I've begun this, right, exploration and the disentangling, right, of what an equal education system is versus an equitable education system is, I've come to realize that I've actually really begun to understand the difference between equality and equity because of a live experiment that's going on in my home. Because I have twin boys that are 5 years old. Okay, so every single day, right, I witness the difference between equality and equity. So these are my boys. Okay, on the left is Tayari and on the right is Amaru. And Amaru, okay, is constantly thirsty. So much so that this dude will literally drop a straw into anything to try to extract liquid. Okay? In this case, he jackpotted. He got a coconut, so he's happy. Okay? And on the left is Tayari. Tayari is constantly hungry. So much so that this dude will literally drop morsels of food on his shirt for later snacking. In this context, is this equal? What do you think? You're shaking your head. You say no. Why do you say no? What's your name? Mary? Mary, why do you say no, Mary? How old are they? 15. It doesn't get any easier, does it? Yeah. Everybody lies to parents of twins, don't they? How often did you hear that? Oh, it gets easier, it gets easier. Yeah.
Someone made a choice that by giving each of them a bottle of water, they're sustaining them equally on this slide. And from the concepts you just shared with us, it is not what is going to sustain them, what they may need primary to move through the day.
Goodness gracious, Mary. I just asked you a simple question, yes or no? You went in a whole diatribe about it. Hey, you could have just said no. No, but this is what happens. You see, Mary, your problem, okay, is that you didn't go from here. You went from here, okay, which means that you changed the question. You just blew right past the question. You're looking at me, you're like, that's the wrong question, dude. Because you see, that is the definition of equal. That is the dictionary definition of equal. Right? Yeah. Well, that's the question, Mary. Oh, you're one of those folks. Yeah, I've had students like you for years. That is the definition of equal, is it not? Okay? But you see, Mary, what you did is you changed the question. You changed the question to, is this fair? Because that's the question, isn't it? Is this fair? And it's not fair. It's radically unfair. But it is equal. There is nothing in the definition of equality that talks about fairness. It presumes fairness. And to your point, sister, because the very design of this nation state, the only industrialized nation in the history of the world to have committed 2 genocides, our foundation is unjust, unfair, radicalized inequality. And so to build a house on top of that foundation, a rotten foundation to the core, and then act as if, right, that house is stable under the auspices that everything is equal, produces the exact results that we have. So one need not be shocked year over year over year when the very same kids fail in schools and the very same kids succeed, because it's baked into the very foundation on which we've built this house. How many of you own homes? They must pay educators well in the Northeast, right? When I do that in California, like 2 people raise their hand. When you bought your home, what was the first thing you had inspected? Why the foundation? Why? I mean, this is New England. Didn't you want to start with the roof, the HVAC system, the place where you're going to put your grand piano, state-of-the-art kitchen, where you're going to throw up your 45-incher? Why'd you start with a foundation? Because the house would be rotten without it. All those upgrades you'd make, your double pane windows, brand new roof, state-of-the-art kitchen, hardwood floors, waste of money if your foundation's rotten, because it's all coming in on it, isn't it? And yet, year over year over year, we invest millions and millions and billions of dollars in schools without actually investigating the foundation on which those schools sit. Rotten to the core. Unwilling. Lack of courage, character, and commitment to actually investigate. Why does this building keep falling in on us when we keep putting up brand new walls, windows, and ceilings? It's foundational, this problem we have. This is why it's a hard pivot, because you got to undo everything you've invested in, and you got to dig out the rotten parts of the foundational core and deal with the fact, as you said, sister, that the very founding documents, right, are at odds with this effort of equity. The very essence, the charter under which we do this public education process, is at odds with this pivot to equity. So if it's going to be more than a strategic plan, if it's going to be an actual commitment to the young people and the families that we have historically failed to serve, then we're going to have to start foundationally. For what are we doing this? Why do we take children from their families for 8 hours a day for 13 consecutive years in some of their most formative moments? Why do we do this as a nation if it is not to build a critically, civically engaged, multiracial, democratic population? Because we ain't doing that right now. And if that's our aim, then we got to make it clear that that's our aim and then set forth in building a very different kind of house sitting on top of that foundation. Now, I'm going to just assume on a wild guess that you all work in districts that are data-driven. Yes? Because you're just like every other district in the nation that we work with. Everybody wants to be data-driven, which I think is actually fantastic. Because I'm a researcher, so I love data. And I think it's absolutely the right move. If we're going to pursue equity, we better be data-driven. Now, 60-plus years of a national commitment to an equal education system has produced a whole heap of data. Now, I'm not from here. I'm from the 3400 block in East Oakland. So to get from my hotel to this here conference center, I had to use this. Now, my preferred navigation system is Waze, but you can use whatever you prefer. It really doesn't make any difference when it comes to data, because to get from my hotel to here, what did I have to put into Waze? An address, also known as, what does Waze see it as? Waze sees it as data. So I had to put data, right, into this system to get me here. Yes? What would have happened if I put the wrong address in? Keith would be up here trying to pretend that he can do a keynote. And he can, actually. He's really good at it. So you guys would have been fine. But I would have been over at some other elite private Northeastern college, walking around like, where are these Nellie Mae people? But I still would have been data-driven. It's not about being data-driven. It's about being driven by the right data. And if you keep ending up in the wrong place, please don't blame Waze. You're putting the wrong data in. If you keep ending up in the same place, the wrong place, with the same group of students, you must be looking at the wrong data. Change the data you're looking at, and it changes the destination. Change the data you're looking at with young people, and it changes the questions you ask. When you change the questions you ask, it changes the answers you come up with. And you might not come up with the right answers, but if you know you got the wrong answers, then you know what? You looked at the wrong data again. We're asking the wrong questions about how do we serve the young people we haven't served well. Here's some data for us. Not long before Arnie Duncan left office, he was all over the national news lauding himself and the Obama administration for having created the highest high school graduation rate ever in the history of the country. Now, at the time, I was teaching high school English in East Oakland at Fremont High School, arguably one of the worst 10 high schools in the United States of America. It's also my neighborhood high school. And so I'm having a moment of cognitive dissonance because I'm listening to the highest educational official in the country talk about us doing better than ever while I'm teaching every day in a place that feels like we're doing worse than ever. And so this is not actually the map that Arnie put out there. You see, I told you I love data. So I actually went and got Arnie's data. And we reran the map. And all we did was to control for one thing. We controlled for income. So this is actually the high school graduation map for non-low-income students. Does this shock anybody? Of course not, because the nation knows that we do pretty well by middle class and wealthy kids. That's the corresponding graduation map for kids living in poverty. This doesn't even code for race or language or immigration status. This is just straight up kids living in poverty. If that's not a national crisis in a pluralistic, multiracial democracy, please do tell what is. That is some of the most profound evidence that I've ever seen of a social apartheid. And I know what y'all are thinking. Texas? Texas cheats, y'all. Y'all don't remember, right? The Secretary of Education under Bush, who didn't last very long. He had to leave because they found out what really happened in the Texas miracle. Y'all remember the Texas miracle when Texas in 1 year had the greatest growth ever in... Y'all know how they got that growth? Y'all don't remember this story? Guys, so amazing how people just can do some straight up dirt and just deuce out and everybody forgets. On the day of statewide testing, state of Texas paid for buses. All of their ELs got on buses and went to amusement parks on test day. Yeah, wow. It's the trick, y'all. That's how you get your test scores up. Buy buses. And then he got promoted to the highest educational seat in the land and quickly had to leave when some reporter was like, why were there buses there on test day? This is our national income data. United States currently has the largest income distribution gap in the history of the industrialized world. No nation ever has had more radicalized income inequality than we have right now, and we're trending the wrong way. That's our corresponding incarceration map. Amazing how similar that looks, isn't it? We are not only the global champs at income inequality, we are also the global champs at locking up our own citizens. No nation state locks up more of its citizens per capita than the United States. In point of fact, Russia is a distant second. There's a great website put out by Mother Jones called Debt to Society that tracks prison rates, prison investments all over the country. Perhaps no corollary data is more important for educators than prison investment, because prison investment often means a direct disinvestment in schools. This is the Global Peace Index. Now, this is one that you probably want to score well on if you claim to be a pluralistic, multiracial democracy that's also a global peacekeeper. The Global Peace Index is flawed like any index. However, it is considered the global gold standard for measuring the health, wellness, and peacefulness of societies in the world. Point of fact, the Global Peace Index is used by the United Nations, it's used by UNESCO, and it's used by the World Health Organization as one of their primary indicators about quality of life in nation states in the world. And every time I put this up, the exact same thing that happens now happens, which is everybody stops looking at me and they start looking at the rankings, because the U.S. is obsessed with rankings. No, we did not make the top 15. We were 94th. 2016 index came out not too long ago, and we're trending the wrong way. What's particularly interesting to me about where we land in this data set is who's ahead of us. Nation states that we are consistently on public record critiquing for their lack of peace, justice, democratic sensibilities, investment in infrastructure. And yet, by the global standard of 3 organizations, which the United States is heavily invested in, including one that we are actually a major player in founding, the United Nations, we suck. And we're trending the wrong way. 2017 suggests we'll end up even further down the list. Now, what's particularly interesting to me about this is that there is no one in this room that lives at 103. In fact, most of us live somewhere in the 20s, maybe even in the teens. Which means what for our nation's most vulnerable students? Where are they living? 120. 119. Only way you get to 103 when you got some portion of your population living at 18 or 20 is if you got some portion of your population living below 103. Brian Stevenson, how many of you are familiar with Brian Stevenson's work? Oh, wow, that doesn't happen a lot. I'm kind of impressed. Brian Stevenson, arguably the nation's most prominent death row lawyer in the United States, argues that one of the biggest problems we have in resolving our biggest social problems is that most of the people that are coming up with the solutions to those problems don't actually have proximity to the pain of the problem. And so we come up with these amazing solutions in conference centers at Babson. They make all kinds of sense, right? Because everything works on the whiteboard, doesn't it? Right? But on the ground, it's messy. Right? And then we get into the mess and we resent the mess. The meaning's in the mess. When you start trying to figure out what the kids need that you are not serving well, you got to get proximate to their pain. That's what's got to drive the policy and the practice that you pivot toward. If you have no proximity to the pain that you're trying to resolve, what you come up with is aspirin. And aspirin will indeed, in the moment, relieve the symptoms of a headache. Will it eliminate headaches? Equity's about eliminating the headache. Aspirin won't get you there. How are you going to get proximate to the pain that you are trying to respond to in schools? If that's not part of your equity strategy, then you won't reach equity. 1854, London, England, faced total collapse due to cholera. There was literally talk of shutting down the city. And as a last-ditch effort to save the city, elected officials got together the top medical minds in all of London, and they sequestered them, put them in a room, just like this. Babson College, circled them up, locked them in. They said, y'all are not coming out of this room until you have a solution for cholera. So all these brilliant medical doctors sitting around a table, knocking around ideas. Eventually, one of them stands up and he says, this is absurd. He said, well, what do you mean? He says, every single idea we're coming up with defaults us to cholera. We're accepting that we're going to be sick, and we're just figuring out how we're going to live with our sickness. And they said, yeah? He said, I didn't sign up to be a medical doctor to figure out how to live in sickness. I signed up to be a medical doctor to figure out how to create the conditions of wellness. Eradication of cholera should be the conversation we're having, not the containment of cholera. They looked back at this medical doctor and they said, well, you're not being realistic. You're not being pragmatic. You're not looking at the data. I hear this said to principals, teachers, counselors, superintendents all the time. They're talking about a radical pivot, something fundamentally different in what they're going to offer to students, families, teachers. Just like they said to this medical doctor. This medical doctor said, well, if that's what it means to be part of your medical association, I don't want to be part of your medical association. And they said, cool. They showed him the door. This medical doctor's name, John Snow. No, not that John Snow. That John Snow. So John Snow hit the streets. He became an ethnographer of the community that he was serving. He got proximate to the pain. John Snow began to collect data. He interviewed as many people as he could that had cholera. He interviewed as many people as he could that didn't have cholera. And what John Snow found in his data is a researcher's dream. His data revealed a perfect binary, causal. What John Snow found was that every single person in London that had cholera drank from that water fountain. And every single person that didn't. So John Snow got a saw, and he cut off the handle, and cholera stopped. Stop drinking from the poison well of an equal education system. There is simply no data to suggest that that is the path to a pluralistic, multiracial, justice-oriented democracy. None. None of the big data. None of the aggregate data. I know y'all can come up with interesting anecdotes about how your school worked for some kid that makes us have some level of evidence that the school's working for all kids. Your aggregate data is crystal clear, just like the aggregate data for every other district in the nation. The pursuit of an equal, under the reality of unequal education system will not produce what you say you want. That's not the question. The question is, will you, as the leaders of your various different communities, have the courage, character, and commitment that John Snow had to stand up and walk away from a system that all of the data suggests is failing the kids who can least afford to have it fail them, and do something fundamentally different? To look at a different data set in pursuit of a different set of outcomes. That is the question. Can we, as the leaders of this work, muster the courage, character, and commitment to be like John Snow? And pursue equity. Because in a model of equity, if you're hungry, you get food. If you're thirsty, you get water. And if you're hella thirsty, you get hella water. Because in an equity model, you get what you need when you need it. Now let's go back to Brown. How did Brown fail so miserably? Well, a lot of folks don't know there's actually two Brown decisions. There's Brown v. Board 1 and there's Brown v. Board 2. Anybody know why the Supreme Court had to re-legislate its own legislation? Why do we have two Brown decisions? What did they realize they left out of Brown 1? Anybody? That's right. They didn't do the second part of the equity equation. They didn't do the win. The most famous line from the Brown decision doesn't actually come from Brown v. Board 1. It comes from Brown v. Board 2. The most famous line from the decision is, with all deliberate speed, which apparently means backwards first. Don't just say what you're going to do in your equity strategic plan. Say when you're going to do it. Because you put a date on it, and now you're accountable. But most people in power are loath to be accountable. They want to talk about how difficult equity is, how complicated it is, how it takes time. We're wrestling with it. We're really... But the people that are dying of cholera don't have time for our time. They need us to start delivering now. Changes have to start happening now. They're terribly inconvenient for leaders to confront that reality. As you think about what you're going to do, make sure that you're having the conversation about when you're going to do it, and inevitably, you'll miss it. You'll miss the date. You'll miss the deadline. And will you step into that accountability? And then push for a new date. Put a date on when you're going to do what you're going to do, or you'll never achieve equity. And know that the research is fully behind you. I will stake my career on this statement. There is nothing currently being used in any district sitting in this room that has the research base of Maslow. Nothing. Maslow released the hierarchy of needs in 1943. It is widely agreed upon across disciplines. Those same disciplines I listed off earlier: social epidemiology, public health, neuroscience, the medical field, psychology, child development, all agree Maslow's right. When you start your equity plan, start here. Everything we know about developing the kinds of outcomes we want in young people is based on this pattern. We also know that the most successful students in school self-actualize, right? They're purpose-driven, right? They take the learning outside of the walls of the classroom. Well, we also know with 100% clarity in all of those fields that I just listed off how to get self-actualization. There is no mystery, and there it is. So if you want self-actualization in all your students, if you say, yes, Jeff, that's what we do, we're down for that, okay, then my next question is show me how you measure it. Show me how you measure belongingness. Show me how you measure love. Show me how you measure self-esteem. Because you measure what matters to you. And if you are telling children that you care about them being loved, and you care about them belonging, and you care about their wellness, and you care about their identity, and you care about them loving themselves, and then all you measure is their reading, writing, and math score, they know you're full of shit. And the most wounded kids have the best bullshit meters. It's what you learn when you grow up wounded. My therapist told me I have superpowers. And I do. I walked into this room. I already know who in this room is full of shit. I'm just kidding. We're all full of shit. Me too. They have superpowers, y'all. That's how you navigate hostile streets to get to the schoolhouse. You got superpowers. You know when to dip to the left, dip to the right, hit the alley, turn around. You know how to walk through the hallway. And you know how to read people's eyes, energy, and behavior. And so when we tell them that all these things matter to us, but we don't measure it, then they know they don't matter to y'all. And when I really need you on these things, you'll disappear on me because you don't measure it. And because you don't measure it, ultimately, it's not going to matter to you when it matters to me most. This is purpose. When you think about what you measure, what you're naming is your purpose as an institution. And I'm a teacher. I've taught for 25 years in my community. I test children. I measure the degree to which they're actually acquiring the skills and the lessons that I'm teaching them. I'm okay with that. But I also measure these things because I know that if I've got kids that can write their asses off but they lack a moral compass, we're just headed for another banking crisis. Y'all know that the people that we can name them, literally name them, the people that are directly responsible for the collapse of the banking industry and the collapse of the housing market. Y'all know this, right? Okay. Well, not only did none of them go to jail, but what's that's totally unshocking to me. Okay. What is particularly interesting to me about those individuals is that they are the nation's highest achieving students. They had the highest test scores. They went to the most elite colleges and universities. They were the walking definition of school success in this country. And they lacked a moral compass. And they used that school success to destroy lives, people, and democratic principles. And I indict us in that. This system that we've built, our lack of willingness to fundamentally investigate what the hell are we doing here? And why are we doing it? And how are we measuring that? If you don't change what you're measuring, you won't change what you invest in. It's such an important shift in beginning to think about, are we actually on the path to equity? Are we making any progress here? I'm not telling you to stop measuring MCAS. You can come down wherever you want on that. I'm fairly agnostic about it. I'm okay with it as long as it stays in its proper place. And the problem is the measurements that we're using to qualify whether or not we're doing our job as a public education system are out of place. We've got to get them in their proper place, and then we've got to surround them with the things that are also fundamentally important to our work. Now, what we know in the research, 4 decades, y'all, 4 decades of research that we have on the practices of the most effective practitioners. 4 decades. Widespread agreement across 4 decades. What those people do, year after year, regardless of the policy reign, regardless of whether they're sitting under No Child Left Behind, Common Core, Doesn't matter. The best practitioners get umbrellas. The policy just rains off of them. And they focus on these three things. Year after year after year. Relationships, relevance, and responsibility. There was a point at which we were close as a nation to naming these three. Hey, we had the third R as rigor, though, instead of as response. Y'all remember that? Hey, the more veterans in here remember that. And we were all about the three R's. Okay? Well, we were on to something there. Okay? And then because we didn't measure the stuff that matters, we pivoted off of it under the auspices that we weren't making enough progress. When in fact, hey, we were on to everything that the research suggests is most important. 4 decades, y'all, of research validates that these three domains matter most for day-to-day practice and school culture. So I'll start with relationships. Now here comes the armor, okay? I'm going to give you a whole reading list, okay, of the best that we have in the research community. I start with Herb Kohl. Herb is one of the first researchers in the nation to study failure. Herb found it particularly interesting that nobody was actually talking to or having meaningful investigative conversations with the kids that were failing in school. And he found them so interesting. How many of you have been or currently are classroom teachers? All right, cool. So y'all remember that kid that would come like every day? I mean, they were there in your class. And then you get to the marking period, and you open your grade book, and they are straight zeros. Haven't done a damn thing. You ever had that kid? Okay. Herb found that kid particularly interesting, right? As do I, right? Herb's conclusion is that's your most committed student. I mean, think about that, right? You come every day to my class, and you don't do shit. That takes some discipline. And so Herb started talking to these kids, right? And what he found is, right, that these children actually have a very intentional and deliberate logic behind this decision. And so probably the most famous quote from this book comes from one of those kids who says to Herb, "Herb, I don't care what you know until I know that you care." And so Herb Kohl's book, I Won't Learn From You, see, he coins this term, willed not learning, to describe this child. It is a willful act to come to your class every day and not learn from you because it's too risky. Because my heart is wounded. And when you have a wounded heart, there's only one safe place. It's your head. And you lock everybody else out of your head to protect your heart. But we keep banging on kids' heads. We keep trying to come up with new tutoring methods. Pearson and Hope Mifflin are offering us all kinds of super strategies, right, to raise literacy for those. How's that going for you, by the way? Right, because it's not research-based. They'll tell you it's research-based, but what you want to do is ask them who did their research. And you know what they'll tell you? Their research team did their research. But we're investing billions of dollars in these corporate, right, textbook companies, and then when they fail, who do they blame? Us, right? Because we didn't implement with fidelity. And here's all our data that shows you that it works, right? But we have a team that can come help you get fidelity. And it's only an additional, right? It's such a racket, right? The research community is pulling our hair out, literally, okay, trying to get schools to stop doing this. There's no panacea. There's no quick solution. You're not going to buy your way out of this with the latest, greatest curriculum approach. Right? You've got to develop. You've got to develop practitioners. That can, and I'm not saying that you don't adopt a textbook. Hey, our school uses Eureka Math, and we use the American Reading Company. Right? And then we modify the hell out of it. Because the American Reading Company is in Pennsylvania. And I have no idea where Eureka is, but it ain't in East Oakland, I can tell you that. Okay? So I'm not saying that you don't have that. I'm not saying that the Common Core gets thrown out the door. I'm saying, hey, How do you develop practitioners to say, okay, how do I take the best and leave the rest? What is the pieces that I can actually use here that is actually responsive to the, that's equity. That's equity. Equality is everybody's going to use it the same way. Okay? And we already know what those outcomes are going to be. All of the research agrees with this. Robert Sapolsky is considered the nation's leading expert, some would argue the global leading expert, okay, on stress. His book, Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers, is mandatory reading in every single medical field. All those fields I've listed off, social epidemiology, public health, neuroscience, neurobiology, all got to read Sapolsky's work. Sapolsky runs one of the most prominent neurobiology labs in the country at Stanford University. Now, this book is about 600 pages in 6-point font. So I don't actually recommend that you read it, okay? Unless you nerd out on this kind of stuff like I do. I find it a very interesting read, but people find me strange. Okay? So if you don't nerd out on that kind of stuff, Sapolsky has an amazing, it's not actually his, National Geographic did an amazing documentary on his work, okay, that you can get on Netflix, you can get it on YouTube, and it is a wonderful summary of about 3 decades of his research that led to this book. Okay? And the title of that documentary is Stress, the Silent Killer. And it has massive implications for how we think about developing classroom and school cultures that are equitable, particularly for kids that are experiencing toxic stress and trauma. Brene Brown. Okay? Assume most people in this room are up on Brene Brown. Okay? She became all the rage because of her TED Talk. Okay? But a lot of folks don't know that Brene actually wrote a New York Times bestseller where she really begins to spread out, okay, drawing from some of the leading research in the country, okay, about why the move from sympathy to empathy matters so much. Understanding this distinction in the neuroscience has had a fundamental impact on the conversations that that field is having. Okay, so let's talk briefly about that. What is sympathy? Right, you feel sorry for somebody. Does anybody know, okay, what kind of neurobiological, okay, impact having a sympathetic relationship has on your body? What does it do to your neural pathways and your biochemistry? What does it do to my neurochemistry and neural pathways if I'm having a sympathetic reaction to her? Anybody know what happens in my body inside? What's that? Brings me down? Okay. No. Nothing happens in my neural pathways or my biochemistry. What about her? What kind of reaction does she have if she knows I'm having a sympathetic reaction to her? The pobrecito. Nothing. What's empathy? Feeling. How many of you have young people that say, I feel you. I feel you, dog. I feel you. They're literally articulating an empathic connection. Right? Welcome to hip-hop. Chuck D once called hip-hop CNN for black and brown people. The real news. Won't nobody else talk about. Right? We're going to do it in hip-hop. I feel you. What happens neurologically and biochemically if I have an empathic connection to her? You know what happens to your body? When you feel them? Absolutely. Yeah, right? You literally connect, right? And it releases a whole bunch of endorphins. The one that's the most compelling, okay, to us in the medical field and in neuroscience and in neurobiology is oxytocin, also known as the happy drug. You know when else you release oxytocin? Okay. Yeah, she said after you have a baby. I've never had a baby, okay? I can't vouch for that, right? I do know the medical research, right? And that is indeed true, but your oxytocin level actually hits its maximum points, okay, not long after you have a baby when what happens? Yeah, when they actually put the baby on your breast, right? One of the best things that you can do for your body, right, and for the baby's body is to breastfeed. Right? This is why the medical field completely changed its practice. Because not too long ago, when the baby came out, what did they do with it? They took the baby away from the mother, and put it into a warmer. Because that was the most important thing, right? Keep you warm, right, bruh? Why'd they change that? Because now, anybody had a baby recently? Or had a family member had a baby? What happens right after the baby comes out? Skin to skin, huh? Skin to skin. Why do they do that now? Anybody know? What's that? Specifically, one case completely changed the medical field. It was a nurse that completely changed how maternity wards operate. Nobody knows. It's a case of twins. There was a set of twins that were born, and as often the case with twins, one of them is less strong than the other one, but in this case, and twins are often born early, multiples are often born early, so these twins were born very early, right? And two brothers, and one of them was doing very well, vitals were excellent, they were in the warmer, and they had the warmer side by side, and the other twin was going down. All the vitals tanking. And doctor's out of the room, nurse is in there, right? And she's not looking at the babies. Her back is turned to them, right? But if you've ever been in one of those rooms, you hear this beep, beep. Right? We got a double one. We got beep, beep. And then we got the slow one. Okay? And then all of a sudden, she hears them level off. And they're both, right, the same rhythm. Beep, beep, beep. She turns around. And the stronger brother had reached over the divider and grabbed his brother's hand. And the weaker brother's vitals immediately stabilized. And she's like, holy shit. Right? And she calls the doctor in. She's like, can't even get the words out, right? And the doctor starts screaming at her. Like, what are you doing? Pulls them back apart. As soon as he pulls them back apart, guess what happens to the vitals? They start tanking again. And the doctor's like, holy shit. Puts her hands back together. Beep, beep, beep. Change the field. That's why you get skin to skin now. Empathy. Skin to skin. I feel you. Undeniable in the medical research about how much contact matters, about how much connectedness matters. Brene Brown's work has blown the lid off this on a whole nother level, because the key to, when you're not infants, because that's how they can communicate, right? Skin to skin. I can't actually communicate, right? So I'm going to communicate, right? Once you start to communicate, the key is shared vulnerability. Shared vulnerability. And who has to share vulnerability first? People with the most power or people with the least power? People with the most power. And who's most loath to be vulnerable? People with the most power. Right? Because they're trying to protect their power. And power allows you to choose when you get to be vulnerable. I don't have to deal with this. I'm deuced out. And that's why kids don't believe us. Because when they're the most vulnerable, when they're raising the most woundedness, we resent them for it. We resent children that aren't compliant. We resent the most wounded children because the most wounded children, as my maestro Jerry Teo of the National Compadres reminds us, the most wounded children speak the most truth. And we punish them for it in schools because they pull back the onion and they reveal to us just how messed up this society is, that we would create children that are in so much pain, and they're terribly inconvenient for us. And they're terribly inconvenient for us because of how we've designed schools. So you can either get rid of your wounded youth or you can change how you've designed your school. There's no other option. What the medical field suggests is that the only option to actually transform outcomes for those kids is for the institutions and the structures that try to hold them to change. And the list goes on and on and on, of the top research institutions in the country, the very same research institutions that you are being lauded for sending your students to. Your schools are defined as successful if they can send kids to these institutions. And yet, your institutions are largely ignoring the research that is coming out of them. That's doublespeak. if that is really the bastion of intellectual thought and progress, then pay attention to the research that's coming out of there. And demand that anybody who's selling you $1 million in textbook and curriculum is aligned with the research that's coming out of there. And if it's not, don't buy it. Because it's misaligned with what you're actually saying you're trying to accomplish. Now, for a couple of these I'm actually going to give you, because I've been in sessions like this for years as an educator, right? Where the slide deck is wonderful, and it's research-based, but what the hell does that look like on the ground with children? Okay? So I'm going to show you. For each of these, right, 2 of them actually, because we don't have the time to do the full keynote today, right, but you're going to get live look-ins, okay, to a classroom where a teacher's actually doing it. Because I want burned into your brain, right, that this is not theory. This is the $1 million move. This is theory to practice. We have clear evidence about what this actually looks like in practice. So the first one I'm going to show you is from a documentary film made in Japan. It's made by the national teacher. It's made a year-long documentary on the National Teacher of the Year in Japan. His name's Mr. Kanamori. The name of the documentary film, which you can get, again, on Netflix, YouTube, it's a great PD. Watching a master educator over time is wonderful PD. The name of the film is Children Full of Life. And so I'm going to play a clip from this, right, as an example of what it actually looks like when a teacher builds a classroom, okay, whose culture is based on relationships and empathy.
Late April, Ren Sueda comes to class for the first time in 4 days. His grandmother died. In his notebook, Ren writes about the death. The funeral is lost.
21日の日曜日、呼ばれて2階に行ったらおばあちゃんは亡くなっていた。おばあちゃんは眠るように亡くなっていた。
They were worried. They didn't know why Ren was away. Now they're moved at his pain and saddened by his loss.
特別式だった。最後のお別れに花をいっぱい入れてあげた。僕は涙がボロボロと出た。みんなも泣いていた。バスで火葬場へ行った。1時間ぐらいでおばあちゃんは骨になっていた。おばあちゃんがいなくなって寂しいです。
The letter unlocks some brutal and long-hidden memories.
私の誕生日の日の前の夜におじいちゃんが寝ながら亡くなってしまって、私はおじいちゃんの顔を見れずに、
Fuyu has been holding down her memories for more than half her life.
3歳の時にお父さんが、話ができてても行きたかったんだけど、書こうと思ったんだけど書けないくらいにして、それで私はお父さんが亡くなった時には3歳だったんだけど、
She'd been afraid to talk about her father. She didn't want to seem different. She'd been depressed. Now, at last, she feels safe enough to talk about her missing parent. trying to understand. They all find it painful. Some find it unbearable. Enomoto is the class sparkler, high energy, charming. He's remembering the death of his granddaughter.
What about time on task? About test prep? I mean, he has the highest test scores in the nation. Because we falsely defined rigor. I see false rigor in schools all the time. Because I know what the research actually defines as rigor. They define it as responsibility for connection. And it's through that responsibility to connection that you get real rigor. And the other thing I want to point out about this particular clip, it's really important for educators to understand, is who is doing the healing in that room. Who's an equity officer in that room? Everyone. Everyone. Everybody thinks that we got to get a super teacher who can heal 25 kids at a time. That's wrong. It's not possible. I've been teaching too long to ever believe that. Instead, what we have to get is educators that are licensed, supported, and developed to create those kinds of classroom cultures where children are healing children, where it's a community, where that's what defines rigor, where writing has a real purpose and it's not an MCAS score. It's empathy. And when writing is about empathy and writing is about telling your story and writing is about healing your woundedness, guess what happens to your test scores? They come along. But that journey's a long arc. It's not going to change your MCAS scores tomorrow. The woundedness that has to heal for those kids to start being able to perform on these arbitrary measurements of their writing is going to take time. Are we willing to invest the time on the journey to equity? Or are we looking for aspirin? You get those kind of relationships, then you got to really wrestle with what are you actually teaching these children? I'm not big on checklists, but I'm going to give you one right now. If you aim to be culturally and community responsive in your curriculum and your pedagogy and your school culture, here's your checklist. When I walk through your schools and your classrooms, can I see students' lives, their communities, their families, and their ethnic, cultural, and linguistic histories? That's your checklist. Everything we know in the research about what actually triggers a positive affectual biorhythm and opens up neural pathways is when students are consistently exposed to this. And we know exactly why, and it's affirmed cross-disciplinary. Oops. Multiple fields have affirmed why this matters. I'm going to show you the pattern that happens inside the child when they get access to culturally and community responsive pedagogy. The first thing that happens is the child's knowledge of self. Self, my own value, my own rootedness begins to emerge. Okay? We see a direct relationship between a child who sees their own value, and I don't mean their value in an aesthetic way. I mean their value in a deeply rooted cultural ancestral way. I know who my people are, and I love my people. So many of the kids that are struggling in your schools right now hate themselves. They hate the color of their skin, they hate the texture of their hair, they hate the color of their eyes, they hate the language they speak, they hate the neighborhood they're from, they hate the nation state that they're from, they hate their ancestral origins, they've been taught to hate themselves. Everything we know in the research is that kid is guaranteed to struggle in school. So you have to start with self. You're amazing. Your value is real, which means that you got to deal with white supremacy, male supremacy, hetero supremacy, class supremacy in yourselves and in your staff. Because that's what's going to get in the way of a student actually authentically believing when I tell you that you're amazing, that I actually mean it. We know that there is a direct relationship between knowledge of self and self-esteem. And where have you seen self-esteem in this presentation already? Where'd you see it? Maslow. Where in Maslow? Right. It's the window into self-actualization. Nobody consistently self-actualizes that does not have strong self-esteem, which means if you want self-actualization, you got to measure self-esteem. How are your schools measuring the degree to which you're positively impacting students' self-love? We know there is a direct relationship in the medical research between self-esteem and hope. The medical field is currently demarcating hope as the only indicator that they found that is directly correlated to a student's ability to effectively navigate toxic stress and trauma. The only one they found. The medical field is literally now measuring hope. And what they found is the primary indicator of hope in a child that is experiencing toxic stress is a caring adult. And the higher number of caring adults that a young person can name, the more likely they effectively make it through the toughest moments of their life. How do you measure the number of caring adults that a young person can name in your building? That is the number one indicator in the medical field about whether or not they're going to make it through the toughest stretches. We also know that there's a direct relationship between hope levels and what Claude Steele refers to as stereotype threat. How many of you are familiar with Claude Steele's work? Good. If you're not, get it. If you test children, you have to read Steele's work. He is the leading thinker in the world of psychology about why certain kids consistently underperform on tests. He's particularly interested in why do kids that we know can do the work. How many of you have ever had a student? They can do the work. And then you sit exam and they choke. How many of you had that kid? Yeah, it's a huge number of kids. Right? We actually know now what's going on biochemically and neurologically that is affecting those kids' performance in tests, and it's actually true for some of you in this room too. Okay? Some of you fit that bill, and we know now why. It's called stereotype threat. Okay? And when your stereotype threat is triggered, you literally release biochemicals in your body that block neural pathways. And when your neural pathways are blocked, guess what you can't access? You can't access what you know. So it literally blocks you from performing on an exam just by how we message what the exam is doing. We also know that there's a direct relationship between interrupting stereotype threat and what psychology refers to as the Pygmalion effect. Anybody heard of the Pygmalion effect before? What is the Pygmalion effect? Anybody? What's the Pygmalion effect? It's a fancy psych term for self-fulfilling prophecy. Okay? So you can read all the research on Pygmalion effect, or you can just listen to Eminem. Because Eminem said, I am whatever you say I am. And we know, right, that what a teacher makes a student feel has a massive impact on what that student actually thinks their possible capacity is. This is known as a Pygmalion effect. What we now know is that you are always creating a Pygmalion effect. Always. There is no neutral ground here. You are always creating a Pygmalion effect. The question is whether or not you're creating a positive Pygmalion effect or what the field of psychology refers to as the Golem effect, a negative Pygmalion effect. And lastly, we know that what causes this is what Carol Dweck refers to as growth mindset. But if you track Carol Dweck's work, so those, I'm going to assume everybody in here is familiar with, anybody not familiar with Carol Dweck? Okay, so well-known researcher coming out of Stanford who came with this idea of the growth mindset, which then became all the rage in virtually every district I was working in. And then Carol, right, had to do a second lecture. Have you seen her second lecture? Because Carol Dweck is pissed off because schools have totally misused her research. Because everybody's all about the growth mindset. And who did they try to develop a growth mindset in? Kids. Which presumes that what? They don't have one. And Carol went back on the lecture circuit and said, that is not what I said. What I said is that students' mindset reflects what? Adult mindset. So if you have students that don't have a growth mindset, it's because you have adults that don't have a growth mindset. The growth mindset work is for adults. And when adults have a growth mindset, kids come along just fine. Didn't your mama ever tell you, if it ain't broke, don't fix it? Our children are not broken. Stop trying to fix them. They are reflecting back to us the systems and the institutions and the cultures therein that we have built. If we want to change student behavior, we've got to change adult behavior. Okay? And when adult behavior shifts, students come right along. Okay? Last is responsibility. When you get stuck with adults or children, triple down on Maslow. Because the people that are the most stuck are stuck. So the first time it won't work. The second time it won't work. Keep going. Okay? Stick with the research. It works. Go again and again and again and work from the bottom up. Food, clothing, shelter, safety. Love and responsibility. Self-esteem. Okay? You get those things humming in anybody's life, okay? And self-actualization takes effect naturally. It is a biological imperative for every human being. So unless you believe that the people that you work with and for are not human beings, you have no other choice. Okay? Because it is the human imperative to self-actualize. The only reason human beings don't self-actualize if something unnatural is in the way. The most effective teachers aren't fixers, they're bulldozers. And what they do is clear away the things that are in the way of children being who they naturally are. They don't try to fix them. They try to figure out what's in the way. Now, of all the stuff I've read, okay, this book is the most valuable tool I've ever come across to respond to kids that are carrying trauma. Bruce Perry is considered the nation's leading expert on child trauma. His book, The Boy Who Was Raised as the Dog, is the Bible in the field right now for understanding what happens when children are exposed to toxic stress and trauma, and what can we do about it. Okay? Some other light reading for you in case you get, bored. Robert Putnam was recently called by Oxford the world's most influential scholar, surely a dubious honor, but nonetheless, his work on bowling alone, identifying the level of isolation that's now happening, and how his second book that just came out not too long ago is the book that I actually recommend most for educators. It's called Our Kids. And it is a historical treatise on what we used to have in schools versus what we have now, and how the isolation we're seeing in the larger society is penetrating schools in a way that is super toxic for our society. Unnatural Causes is a 6-part film series put out by PBS. It is the largest study ever conducted in the research community on this question. Is inequality making us sick? Short answer? Yes. Okay. Biggest threat to health on the planet is inequality. Widely agreed upon across all those fields. So if you want a healthy school community, then at the top of your list has to be the eradication of inequality if you're going to be data-driven and research-based. And I mean all forms of inequality. No oppression Olympics. So you can't be tackling white supremacy and ignoring male supremacy. You can't be tackling male supremacy and ignoring class supremacy, and you can't be tackling class supremacy and ignoring heterosupremacy. Okay? All forms of inequality on the table all the time. All forms of inequality odious to a public institution that is serving children that are supposed to move this country forward on its pursuit of a pluralistic, multiracial democracy. Third is the new Jim Crow. Hey, it is so important that educators read and understand the new Jim Crow, because what Michelle Alexander's research reveals is that writing a referral on a child is not a benign act. Sending a child to the office is not a benign act. Once you put ink to paper, what we know in the research is that that child is exponentially more likely to contact juvenile hall. We also know that if a child contacts juvenile hall, they are exponentially more likely to contact the pen. We are directly implicated in this pipeline. Now, it's not enough to tell teachers to stop sending kids to the office. What is your viable alternative? It's the only tool teachers have in their box right now. So we've got to do a better job of supporting the conversation and the practice about what do you do when a kid is nutting up? What do you do when it's not safe to hold that child in the classroom? What do we do then? Those are the much more real conversations we need to have, outside of just saying, oh, we're not going to suspend kids anymore. Now, I'll end with a look into my classroom, and a classroom where I actually team taught with one of my colleagues who's here today, Shireen, who's doing her doc work at UCLA and is one of the better high school English teachers that I've encountered in my day. And so Shireen apprenticed in our classroom, and she actually had a major role in this particular student sharing that you're going to hear. And what I'm going to say before I share this is that I just want to acknowledge that some people in this room may get triggered by what you hear. And if you do, I just encourage you to take whatever space that you need to process that. And I encourage your colleagues to pay attention when your colleagues get triggered by some of the things that they hear. Now, when I think about my responsibility as an educator, when I think about my responsibility as a father, when I think about my responsibility as a community member, and when I think about my responsibility as an academic and a researcher, I think about this kid. And I think about how am I going to create classroom cultures, school cultures, pedagogy, curriculum that is responsive to this child when she shows up to our schools. carried it since she was 4. That's my 10th grade English class. And then she went through kinder, 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, and my 9th grade English class. Before she was permitted to use writing to tell that story. What an indictment. And is it any wonder that on the first day of my class in 9th grade, that child started a fight in my class? I had her for 4 consecutive years. That's 6 weeks into year 2. That does not happen overnight. It's time and moving through that you just started a fight in my class. And I'm going to hug you. And I'm going to choke you out. That's the part we don't want to deal with. Everybody wants to get to that. But the pain and the hardship and the challenge to get there, all the assignments she didn't do, all the extra time that it takes to get them there, that's the piece we have to be more honest with. That's the structural changes we got to be willing to make if we're going to meet our responsibility to meet that child's needs and meet them much earlier. How do we create classrooms where that is rigor, where that is the purpose of reading and writing and math and science, is to address the woundedness? That's how we stop the shooting in our communities. That's the shooter. Only a child who looks in the mirror and hates themselves can point a weapon at somebody that looks just like them and pull the trigger back. Only way we're going to stop homicide in our communities, self-love, understanding our own value. And the key institution to that is the schoolhouse. And the key space in the schoolhouse is the classroom. How do we develop those kinds of classroom cultures where that doesn't become chisme? That doesn't become cyberbullying. How does a child stand up? Do you hear her peers? Just like Kanamori's class. Go ahead, we got you. Why are they saying that? Why are 16-year-olds saying that? Because they know they're up next. And they know they're going to tell the same damn story. And I'm going to hold you right now because when I come up there, I'm going to need you to hold me. That's the purpose of education in a pluralistic, multiracial democracy. The purpose of education is not to escape poverty. The purpose of education is to end it. And the narrative that we're upholding right now is you can use this to escape. You can use this to get out of here, to distance yourself from your brothers and sisters' pain. And that is a social apartheid. And that explains perfectly all of the data that I showed you at the beginning. If we're going to disrupt that, then the purpose of school has to change. There is a story that's told by the Cherokee, many other indigenous communities, but I'll borrow from the Cherokee in this particular instance. The Cherokee tell a story about a young child that's out in the front yard playing, and he comes running into the house, and he runs up to his abuelita, his grandma, and he says, "Abuelita, I feel like there's a war going on inside my head." She says, "There is, mijo." He says, "Who's fighting, abuelita?" She says, "The 2 wolves." He says, "Who are the 2 wolves, abuelita?" She says, "One wolf is rage, avarice, greed, selfishness, violence." He says, "Who's the other wolf, abuelita?" She says, "The other wolf is cariño, familia, love, empathy." He says, "Who wins, abuelita?" And she says, "The one you feed." That wolf is alive in every single person in this room, every child and family we serve. That is not the question. That is the human condition. The question is, what will we feed in the schools, in the classrooms, in the culture, in the leadership? Because what we feed is what we will get back from those babies. We certainly do not have it all figured out in our community. I would never promise you that. I can promise you that we're attempting to make a hard pivot and head in a very different direction and see where that lands us, because where we are right now is completely and totally odious to me. And And I am raising 2 5-year-old boys in one of the most violent communities in the United States. And I cannot have it. And I believe that schools are the place, the institution best positioned to transform that. But that means that institution has to be transformed. If I can help you in any way on your journey to engage in that work in your respective communities, please do not hesitate to reach out. I cannot promise you answers, but I can promise you solidarity, empathy, and thought partnership. Thank you.